Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey podcast. This podcast aims to form and transform our community so that each of us can better reflect God's image. I'm Dr. Christopher Tomaszewski. I'm the assistant professor of philosophy here at Belmont Abbey College, and I'm our host for today's episode. I'm joined by Father Thomas Petri, the president of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., and we're excited to talk about truth and pursuing truth in today's society. But I'll let Father Petri introduce himself a bit more before we start. Father?
It's a great privilege to be here at Belmont Abbey College. I'm happy to be visiting from Washington, D.C. I am the president of our pontifical faculty at the Dominican House of Studies, which is the seminary, if you will, for the St. Joseph Province of Dominicans, the eastern province of the United States. It's where we have, for over 100 years, formed our Dominican student brothers to be great, we hope, great Dominican priests and preachers. And we form other religious men and women, and laymen and women, to be great teachers and evangelizers of the culture.
Fantastic. Well, we're delighted to have you here at our Benedictine institution, a meeting of brothers in the faith, Dominicans and Benedictines. And we're obviously surrounded by an institution dedicated to the pursuit of truth. Obviously, universities are Catholic in their origins, as I hope we're all aware. But even beyond the Catholic realm, there's secular colleges and universities that purport to be academies within which the truth is sought, and not only sought, but hopefully reverenced. I think maybe there's some reason to worry whether the mission of the university in the 21st century is still in alignment with truth in that way. So hopefully we'll be able to say some things about truth and the pursuit of truth, especially in the academic context. So obviously, as a Dominican, one of your North Star for contemplating many things, but obviously including and especially the truth, is St. Thomas Aquinas. How does St. Thomas Aquinas define truth, and what implications does his definition have for our understanding generally of knowledge and reality?
Well, at the most fundamental level, for St. Thomas Aquinas, truth is the configuration or the alignment of mind to reality, right? Now, that has implications. I mean, that's not, I think, if you were to pull any individual off the street, that's necessarily how they're going to understand truth. In an unself-reflective way, it's not how most people understand truth in the culture today. The implications for St. Thomas are, first, that there is such a thing as objective reality, and that the mind is actually made to know objective reality, to know the world, and to conform itself to the world and to reality. So truth for St. Thomas, and certainly for Catholics and Christians, but anybody who is operating from any objective understanding of science and knowledge until the modern era, truth is not something that's personal. It's something that claims me, that I get configured by and conformed to. And I think, as you alluded to in your introduction, it's not always clear that that's what people still understand by truth. And I think there are interesting reasons why that's the case.
Right, so you say that truth is not personal. That interests me a little bit as a philosopher, because, of course, Aquinas' definition of truth, while not making truth subjective or personal in that sense, is a relational definition, right? It's an adequation of intellect and reality. I'm trained in a philosophical tradition, the contemporary Western analytic tradition, where it's very popular to say that truth is like a property of propositions, right? Where the propositions are imagined to live up in Plato's heaven as abstract entities, and truth is just this property that those propositions have. They either have the property of being true or the property of being false. Do you think there's significance, or does it make a difference in the way we think about truth in moving from that more kind of abstract, maybe Platonic way of thinking about truth to a model in which it's about the relation of a human intellect to the world?
Oh, absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think sometimes St. Thomas is accused of being too abstract in his understanding of propositions and truth, which I would want to vehemently deny and defend him against. Because, right, truth is relational, and the fact is our minds are made to know truth and to know reality. And the more we know, regardless of what we know, whether they're speculative truths, whether they're practical truths, what we know begins to configure us. We become what we know, for St. Thomas, right? And I think as a man of faith, and I think, he would not always I would not want to make a hard distinction between his philosophical thought and his theological thought as we tend to today. But remember always, as a man of faith, for him, truth is a person. It's Jesus Christ, right? And so the more truth and the more I study, whatever I'm studying, if it's authentic truth, whether, I think G.K. Chesterton has that line, whether it's a grub worm or an angel, somehow is configuring me, but also bringing me closer to the one who is truth, which is Jesus Christ.
Fantastic. Yeah, great. Thank you. So you mentioned truth not being personal in this subjective sense. In what ways do you think the modern notion of personal truth can, in a way that introduces this subjectivity, contrasts with St. Thomas's way of thinking about truth as something that, in some sense, we conform ourselves to or ought to?
Well, so I think the modern world, and your viewers, your listeners, I'd recommend the work of Carl Trueman. I'm not sure if you've read any of his books, but he's got a couple great books. One is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is much more scholastic and scholarly, but he wrote a sort of Cliff Notes version for the average layperson, which I highly recommend to everybody, called A Strange New World. But his argument, I think, is a correct argument, using great people like Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, Philip Reeve, is that we've come to a point in our culture, certainly in Western society, in which he defines it as sort of a society in which truth is simply expressive personalism. That, and you see this in a lot of the debates in our culture right now, that truth is my truth, and I not only get to affirm what truth is for me, and you not only have to accept that, you have to applaud it. And if you do not applaud it, if you do not accept it, you're labeled and categorized as a bigot, or and you're doxxed or canceled in today's culture. Now, St. Thomas, this sort of understanding would not be articulatable or even understandable 50 years ago, let alone in the 13th century. I think Carl Trueman says at some point, even the very basic question, "Are you happy in your job?" would never have been a question his father would have asked himself. So what's happened through just the Enlightenment, through culture moving away from God, but yet still requiring some understanding of human nature and morality, is morality has turned into something much more subjective or based on a social construct, rather than based on the reality of a given human nature given to us by God, by our Creator, to which we must not only be true to and normed by, but in fact which helps us to grow in perfection and virtue. And so I think there's a real challenge we face in helping to articulate even some of the basic presuppositions. St. Thomas classically holds that you can argue and have debates and arguments with folks if you have some shared assumptions. But increasingly, I doubt that we have a lot of shared assumptions with some of our interlocutors on the nature of humanity, on the nature of morality, on the nature of reality.
Right. Yeah. When I think about the term personal truth, something that also comes to mind for me, a term I think we hear often in the culture, is lived experience. Mm-hmm. And there's this strange inversion with that term, where obviously the term experience imports this idea that I am somehow receptive to something and I'm growing and learning from that. But normally when people appeal to their lived experience, it's to impose something, yes, in a certain sense on the listener, or maybe on their on reality itself in a certain sense. So I guess, right, there's this strange inversion of the way that we think about the relationship between person and reality in a lot of contemporary ways of thinking about truth.
Well, and recently, just earlier this week, the Holy See issued the document Dignitatis Infinita, and this brings this up, that what suddenly has happened is that claims to dignity have been subverted to understand simply the claim of personal identity, and that right, my personal identity is the claim of dignity, which must be respected, which in turn, as you mentioned, gives more authority to personal expression than in fact it should have. Right?
Right.
I should be configuring myself to reality and not attempting to think reality is going to configure itself to me. It's a strange place to be in. But I think when you mentioned lived experience as something that, or experience as something we should be open to, that still gives me a little bit of hope, because I do think, and this is this is a typical natural law argument, right? I do think life and experience eventually reveals truth to people if they're living authentically or self-reflectively. Now, it might be a painful lesson, lessons of contradiction and pain and sorrow before even questions like why is this happening to me can come up. But I do tend to be optimistic that people who are attempting to impose something that's unnatural to reality, even in how they choose to live or how they choose to view the world, will eventually, it has to sort of, for lack of a better word, blow up at some point, because it can't, I don't think we can live in such contradictions forever.
Yeah, I think it strikes me as kind of the moral side of the truth can't contradict truth coin, right? We often talk about truth not being able to contradict truth when we're worried about potential conflicts, maybe between faith and science, or faith and reason more broadly. But I often think about that same maxim in connection with people who are leading lives that are in whatever kind of way they might be, not entirely integrated or authentic, that eventually the rubber is going to have to meet the road somewhere, and a coming to terms with reality is inevitable.
And I think that's also true on a cultural level, right? So when you have a culture that is promoting values or norms that, for instance, biology doesn't matter, that can't but be a problem down the line in one way or another.
Right. Great. So let's talk a little bit, I guess, about what we might call epistemology in contemporary philosophy. Where can truth be discovered, according to St. Thomas?
Well, I mean, truth can be discovered in all things that the mind can apply itself to. Not just external things, but even in ruminations and the internal thought process, speculation, and contemplation. But I think St. Thomas he has a broad view of truth being actually studyable in all disciplines, being cohesive in bringing us to understand and know not just ourselves and not just the world, but to know God. So I think that there's a variety. He would not. I don't think St. Thomas would want to dispute or diminish any sort of academic pursuit or any study of truth or pursuit of truth. I also don't think that he would necessarily believe that the study of truth is simply for its own sake, as say Aristotle would, because I think for St. Thomas, the study of truth is for the fulfillment of the human person and for union with God, ultimately.
Okay, that's interesting. I guess for a number of reasons. I'm not thinking about study of the truth for its own sake. Obviously, a lot of the truth that we study, especially in the context of Catholic thought, is aimed at the moral and the spiritual lives, which are in turn aimed at union with God.
Yep.
But when we're thinking about the really long term, the hopeful long term to which we all aspire, the beatific vision, final union with God, might we reasonably describe something like the beatific vision as truth for the sake of truth?
Yeah, I think so, and I'll concede that. I certainly would concede that. I guess when I say this, I mean to say that truth under the aspect of simple knowledge, right? But truth is considered differently under the aspect of the beatific vision under God, right?
Of course.
And so I'd want to caution on simply abstract intellectual pursuits. Right, versus a sort of an intellectual pursuit that in fact and also leads eventually through virtue, the will, and the passions.
This might be where we make a careful distinction between the virtue of studiousness and the vice of curiosity.
Exactly. Yeah, Wikipedia is not helpful for this.
Exactly, yeah.
So Wikipedia is not the goal of,
of course,
the pursuit of knowledge.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I guess one other thing we might add to that in terms of where the truth can be discovered, one easy way of kind of seeing from a 30,000-foot level Aquinas' thought about that is, well, truth is a transcendental. So in a sense, the answer to that question is everywhere.
Exactly.
So given the vast amounts of information in today's society, and I think here it's kind of important to distinguish between what we might call truth and knowledge on the one hand and information on the other. Yeah. How can we discern truth from falsehood against the abundance of content in various forms, news, videos, entertainment, social media?
I think that's a big question. That's a difficult question to answer. Obviously, I can give you some bullet points of what I think people need to consider. Right. One is, as you just mentioned, not all information is about the pursuit of truth. And we were just talking about the vice of curiositas. I think we are bombarded now. I mean, we carry around in our pockets screens that have access to all sorts of information. 90% of it is not useful, and 90% of it is not helping us grow closer to God or grow closer to truth. I think the discernment of truth has to happen, obviously as a man of faith in prayer, but more importantly, in community and in communion with those who are scholars, those who are our elders, those who are experienced more than us. I think that's the whole point of a university. That's the whole point of a collegium, which is not just to have masters and professors, but to have peers in which the truth is pursued in a communal way. And I think that's the beautiful thing of the university, right?
Yeah, and I think this is incredibly important for approaching ethics in the way that Aristotle and St. Thomas do, a virtue ethics, which of course is a ethics which can't be reduced to a rule book, but consists in the development of virtue, and the development of virtue in turn is about it is always developed in relationship to not just peers, but role models, people that we can look
That's
up
right.
to, people who are moral exemplars.
When I taught Providence College for 4 years before coming to the Dominican House of Studies and taught moral theology to college students, but I would always emphasize this point that Aristotle says, right, that the young should not study moral philosophy, because I think he understood that young people want a manual, a rule book. They want a formula. Let me put in all the variables and then tell me what to do.
Exactly.
And morality is not that way. There's very few things, even in our Catholic faith, that are black and white. I mean, there's a whole lot of there's a field of choices that we can choose in any given situation. And so I think just right. I mean, growing in virtue, which is to say primarily also growing in prudence, requires community, requires some learning, requires, here's this word that we're talking about, like a certain lived experience, making mistakes and reflecting on them. And I agree with you. I love having the role model, and I would always advise my students, we all know people in our lives, whether it's parents, grandparents, maybe a professor, that we think are virtuous and prudent. And you know them so well, you can kind of figure out what they would tell you to do. And I would always share with students, even if you can't ask them, imagine a conversation, and whatever you think that person will tell you to do, probably you should do.
Right. Yeah. This distinction between information and knowledge is kind of fascinating to me too, because it illustrates a way in which certain truth can not only be not necessarily very useful to us, but even potentially dangerous. I routinely have, in when talking about ethics with my students, sometimes or just not just students, but just people who are not trained in philosophy or theology, I find that like the concept of detraction is often hard for people to even understand, right? I'll point out to people or try to gently lead people away from conversations that are going in that direction. I find often people are it's not just that they reject the idea that detraction can be morally wrong, they're perplexed by the idea that I could say something true and that it's morally wrong, that there's information that we shouldn't share, that certain things should be kept private. And I find that fascinating, especially in an age where I feel as though in a certain sense we all value our privacy so much, but at the same time we think that if something is an item of knowledge, something that we can show is true, well, then it's legitimate to spread it around as much as we can.
I think that's a great insight, and I think it's you can see it. It's perpetuated by most social media platforms. That it is true. I mean, the Catechism speaks about detraction as distinct from calumny. Calumny is to say something about a person that's false, to assassinate their character. But detraction, it is a sin, even if the thing is true, right? And so, I agree. We do live in a culture that tends to value to the deficit or to the death of all other values, that every bit of knowledge has to be shared, especially if it's a negative bit of knowledge, and that's that's where I think growing in virtue and prudence and discernment. And I tend to think that this happens easier as people get older in life.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's the young, but unfortunately, we see in our culture, even people who are older still can regularly engage in detraction and not understand that it, in fact, is morally wrong.
Yeah, I think it tells us something important about truth too. That the truth, like many great things, is extremely good. But precisely because it's so good, it's also, in a sense, dangerous.
That's right. It can be perverted very easily.
It could be right. Yeah, it could be perverted easily.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So why is the pursuit of truth important for individuals, both in their academic and professional endeavors, as well as their personal lives?
Well, I mean, we've touched on this a little bit already. I mean, for St. Thomas, and I obviously agree with this, the pursuit of truth is how we're made. It's what we're made to do. You know, we want to know things, and we're always seeking to know the answers. Whether it's knowing how to, turn on a car when you're, 14 years old, trying to learn how to drive to get your license at 16. Whether it's knowing how to get across campus and where your dorm and where the dining room is, and whether it's knowing how to get a job and knowing political science if you want to be a politician, and ultimately how you know God. I mean, I think it's I would classify it a pathology. And I'm sure we would call it depression if we encountered individuals who just stopped wanting to know in life, right? So I just think it's hard, we're hardwired, and we can't stop knowing. And of course, for St. Thomas, this is one of his great arguments for the existence of God, right? We want to know what's behind it all. And simply knowing the effects of God and simply seeing his created world and his order, and knowing that, we want to know what the cause of that is too, deeply down, right? And I think that's why pursuit of truth and knowledge is so. I think it's important because I don't think we can do anything else, and I think that the challenge is to pursue it rightly and correctly and morally and authentically.
Right. So I find this distinction between the academic pursuit of truth and the personal pursuit of truth interesting, because one of my constant struggles with intro students is to try to get them to see philosophy as something more than just an academic discipline. Trying to teach them that there's a sense in which philosophy is different from their math class or their chemistry class, right? Where, in a sense, to talk about the academic pursuit of mathematics or the academic pursuit of chemistry is, maybe with a few exceptions, to exhaust what there is to pursue in mathematics or chemistry, but that when it comes to something like philosophy or theology, it's a little bit different insofar as, we here at Belmont Abbey require students to take philosophy and theology. And part of what I want my students to understand is we don't primarily intend that, I guess, right, as something for them to pursue academically. Obviously, most of them will not become philosophers, which is good because there's not enough jobs for them anyway.
Right.
But for them to understand that this is supposed to be deeply personal in a way that their other courses aren't necessary, that this is supposed to inform how they live and how they pursue wisdom and truth on a personal level, in a way that obviously a course in mathematics or chemistry doesn't form them in that precise way.
No, I'm happy to hear that because obviously I agree with that. I think the challenge that most colleges, certainly Catholic colleges and universities face, and certainly the challenges that liberal arts programs face, is the really heavy emphasis in higher education now, because they're responding to what students want, which are the practical sciences.
Right. Yeah.
Because the practical sciences is where jobs are, it's where job security is, it's where perceived the money is, and of course, as I know you'd agree with this, practical knowledge is obviously very useful and good, but it's not speculative knowledge and answering these larger questions like the nature of my life and the nature of life and the nature of humanity and things like the nature of love and faith and existence. I mean, these are the things that I always hope for your students and for students taking intro to philosophy courses or theology courses that they really latch onto and don't stop asking even after the semester's over.
Right. Yeah. No. I when I moved here and started this job here at Belmont Abbey, I bought my first house, and I have since then become a even greater admirer of various practical arts. You know, when I call a plumber or an electrician,
Yep.
I want someone who's going to know what they're doing. But something I try to point out to my students is as good and as valuable as all that is, in a sense, all of that stuff is done for the sake of leaving us, opening up the possibility of leisure for us to pursue things like
Absolutely.
philosophy and theology. Yeah.
Yeah. Hopefully they could do both, you know, like find
Of
time
course.
for both in their lives. You
Of
know? I
course,
mean, there's nothing, I mean, I know a guy back in Kentucky where I grew up, and, you know, he's a carpenter, but he would also read a lot of, he does a lot of reading of literature and, you know, philosophy, and never got a bachelor's degree, but I would say he's still a very educated man.
Some of the you know, some of my favorite interactions in philosophy is when people come up to me in person or they send me an email, and it's someone who maybe, you know, studied something else in college, or they never even went to college, but now they're in their 50s or their 60s, and they've accomplished maybe most of or all of what they wanted to accomplish in their careers, and they're beginning to reflect on, okay, but now what? Now,
Yeah.
what do I do? What do I do with my life now? And it's at that moment that I think the value of philosophy begins to really strike them, as well as theology, of course. Yeah. So I think this is an important question. We're in an election year. Truth is frequently politicized and polarized in many instances. Especially as Catholics, what actions can we take to ensure the faithful transmission of truth free from distortion? Are there specific steps we can implement?
Yeah, I think the first thing we should always, especially in these election years, and especially in our country, which is deeply polarized, you know, at this point in its history, is to realize that truth is not partisan, you know, and that even when it comes to political realities and moral realities, that candidates on different sides of the spectrum can actually be saying and holding true things, you know. And no candidate or no party, certainly in America, holds everything that is true. You know, we have to be careful with that, I think, as Catholics, even if we might want to weigh towards one or the other.
Sure.
You know, but I think just being able to not get too, and for me, Pope Benedict XVI's pontificate and Deus Caritas Est was very important, and for my own sort of conversion, if you will, on this matter, is that these political realities, they will come and go, but you know, truth remains, and the Lord remains, and our faith remains. And so Benedict, probably because he was mostly an Augustinian, had a very sort of serene outlook on the divisions in the world and the struggles of the world, a very hopeful outlook, actually, that he knew the truth of Jesus Christ, the truth of the church, and while obviously he lamented and prayed for the world and culture, he was not horrified, or he never got the sense he was personally, like, what's the right word here? Personally agitated, or, you know, he wasn't losing sleep over the state of everything, you know.
Right.
And I think that's a great attitude for us to have, especially as we go into an election year and we're seeing more and more divisiveness in our country and our culture.
Of course, yeah. I think probably good advice within the church too. See a lot of division, at least in the American church now. I've been witness to some of this division, and I think whether secular politics, ecclesiastical politics, whatever the case may be, I think this is an important point where it's important to remember that there are intellectual virtues and not just moral virtues. I spend time trying to inculcate this idea with my students as well, right? I think there's the sense in which we think about virtue is about how I behave.
Right.
And there's a modern and contemporary forgetfulness about the idea that Aristotle and St. Thomas think, no, virtue isn't just about what I do,
right.
not just about how I behave, it's not just moral, it's about how I think too.
Yeah.
I think there's probably something about the American egalitarian spirit that virtue isn't supposed to be about how smart I am or something
Right.
like
I
that.
think that's
It's
right.
supposed to be about, it's supposed to be about my character. But I think this leaves something important out, which is that part of our endeavor in trying to become good human beings has to be how to think rigorously about important topics, about political
right.
issues, right? This isn't about becoming less political, but about learning how to do politics well. And a big part of that is intellectual virtue.
And I think, yeah, and that means study. A lot of that means study and studying rigorously. This is why, 24-hour news stations aren't always the most helpful in helping to build intellectual virtue, because
Right.
real thought takes more than sound bites.
Of course, yeah. Okay, so how can we work toward cultivating a society that cherishes truth? And is there a method to shift the perception of truth from a subjective personal experience to a universally acknowledged reality?
Well, this is a question, of course, that a lot of us talk about all the time, like how, because this is a big cultural question, especially as we've talked during our time here on the culture's temptation or tendency to espouse a sort of personal expressivism. And there are a lot of ways. You can think about this in terms of policy and how you might work to push certain policies through government or through education. But you can also think about this: what can I do as an individual? And as a theologian, as a priest, that seems to me to be where I am on most of this. Especially, earlier we mentioned that even some arguments you can't even begin to have the dialogue or discussion because we don't share even common assumptions anymore.
Right.
And so I often think, and this is, might sound a little strange, especially if we're talking philosophy, I have to think that the real thing we ought to do is to live our Christian lives well and good, and be good, and people who are knowledgeable and charitable and moral, and through that help to introduce people to Jesus Christ, and to really convert minds and hearts. And sometimes that means converting the heart first, and then hoping once you have someone who acknowledges that there is a God, that there is a Lord, and that He loves us and has a plan for us, then I think that would open up the mind to explore other questions of what that means.
Right.
Yusu.
Yeah, so I think this is great because I think part of, let me be the first to say as a philosopher, this is where I think grace plays an enormous role because I was talking about abortion with some of my students recently, and we came across this question of among some really philosophically sophisticated pro-choicers, right? Some of them just reject the concept of personhood as morally relevant altogether, right? So it's very hard to try to find, as you said, any kind of common ground on which to have a meaningful dialectic with them, because obviously when you're trying to convince somebody that abortion is morally wrong, one of the concepts you immediately reach for is personhood. Maybe especially, right, as someone becomes more educated, I find this often in philosophy. My fellow philosophers are often some of the most frustrating people to interact with because they're so intelligent and they know all the right moves to make to avoid having an inconsistent position.
Yep.
And what I think about when I have those kinds of encounters is maybe we've reached the point where I can do no more aside maybe from pray, and this is really something where we're entering the domain where there's a need for a grace that breaks through consistent but false worldviews and really delivers that kind of punch of truth that we hear about, obviously, from St. Paul, St. Augustine, other great saints.
When you see this happen in history, the saints, and and I'm sure we both have friends that this has happened to. I think that's right. I think you get to a point, and it's not like it's not like your dialogues or your interactions are useless. I mean, they're sort of preambula fide, right? I mean, that's what we hope, that they become, the preambula to grace working in them, and so at least they're ready and receptive when grace punches through, right? And I'm a big believer. I think when we're young, and certainly when I was young, I probably operated off this false mentality that you can argue people into the truth.
Right.
But as you well know, as you say, there can be real consistency intellectual, and if the will is sort of locked in this, it's going to be hard to break through. And I think that's where grace can do more than we can.
Right. Okay, fantastic. So as we conclude, thank you for joining us, Father Petri. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you have enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, tell your friends about Conversatio, and please know that it's available on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Until next time, God bless.